Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. In today's webinar, I'm going to show you how to build your first web components app. We are going to build a conference management app using the Lightning Web Component Framework, which is a UI framework that we have developed and used in Salesforce. First of all, I want to introduce myself. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a lead developer evangelist at Salesforce, and this is my Twitter handle in case that you want to contact me later. Also is with me Peter Cheetham, who is another developer evangelist, and he will help with questions at the end of the webinar. If you have questions, you can start asking them in the chat window. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, but if we run out of time and your question is not answered, you can head to the Trailhead community and ask it there. We have a couple of communities for general questions, but also another one which is developer focused, and you can ask your question there. And also you can follow me on Twitter or follow our official Salesforce developers accounts and ask your question there. This is a slide that means that you should make your purchasing decisions based on the functionality that is currently available in the market and not in pilot or beta features. And with that, let's start talking about Lightning Web Components. If you haven't heard about Lightning Web Components before, I will give you a really quick introduction. So basically, what has happened is that in the last years, there's been a huge evolution of web standards. Web components are now supported by all the major browsers. However, web components have some challenges that we need to solve. And in Salesforce, we have decided to create Lightning Web Components, which is a UI JavaScript framework built on top of Web Components standard. The Lightning Web Component framework makes easier to create web components because it takes care of templating, of handling the rendering lifecycle, security, performance, backwards compatibility, and much more. Additionally, to work on Salesforce, we have released more tooling on top of Lightning Web Components, but we decided this year to open source the part of the framework that is not tied to Salesforce at all, and that you can use to build Lightning Web Components off platform. This means that you can build Lightning web components and run them in Heroku, in AWS, or even in Lightning Pages. Okay. Sorry, I got a question that the presentation got stuck. Are you still seeing my slides? Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. So I'm not going to give you more explanations about the foundations of Lightning Web Components, but what you can do is to review these two webinars that took place in CodeMotion some weeks ago. The first one was given by two architects of the Lightning Web Components team, and it's a really cool webinar in which they explain how they have solved all those challenges that web components present. And the second webinar was given by another developer evangelist from my team. And in this webinar, he got into the details of how web components are built and all about the security layers that are implemented, performance, and so on. So I strongly recommend you to take a look at these webinars. Okay, so as I am a developer, I love demos, and that's what we are going to do today. We are going to build a conference management app with web components, and we are going to use the Lightning Web Components framework to build that. In the app, we are going to have a list of conferences. We are going to be able to filter those conferences, and we are going to be able to navigate to see the details of the different conferences. And which is the best way to start working with Lightning Web Components open source? Well, the best way is going to this URL that I have here, and that's what I'm going to do. So this is lwc.dev, the main starting point in which we'll have a section with all the documentation about web components. If you want to know how HTML templates are implemented or how to compose components or anything in detail, you can go to this section of the guide. Then we have another section that shows all the communities that you can join to ask questions. Normally, people are very happy to answer your questions. And we have also another section, which is a sample app built entirely with Lightning Web Components. In this sample app, you will find recipes of simple code examples, simple use cases of how to solve things as how to perform component composition, how to communicate child and parent components, and much more. So we're going to start from scratch. I'm going to go to the installation section, and here we can see that the best way to start an app is to use Node and concretely npm. So we have created a package called create LWC app. So if you want to create an app, what you have to do is to copy this command and execute it in your terminal. So let's do that. We're going to our terminal here, and we are going to execute this command. So what's going to happen now is that this tool is going to download all the dependencies that we need to create Lightning Web Components open source, and a wizard is going to start asking me the properties of the app that I'm going to create. If I want to create a JavaScript app or a TypeScript app, and we will see that in a second. Meanwhile, I want to show you that you don't want to install the Lightning Web Components CLI locally, and you want to do a quick test. Here in the documentation, we have a playground in which you can quickly write some code, okay, and see the result of the code in the right-hand side and see quickly how your web component looks like. But for our conference app, we're going to continue with the installation of the modules. This should finish in a moment. And with this tool, not only we are going to download all the dependencies, but also we are going to create all the files that are necessary for my app, all the scaffolding for the app. So this has finished. I'm ready to start creating my app. So I'm being asked for a package name. I'm going to write conference app. That's going to be my package name. I'm going to stick with an empty description, and I am the author. I will stick to the default version, and here I'm going to select an open source license because Lightning Web Components is open source, so you have to select an open source license. In this case, we will stick with the MIT license. You can also link your package, your project to a GitHub repo. And you can select a package manager, npm or yarn. In my case, I will select npm because I'm more familiar with it. And you can create two kinds of applications. In my case, I'm going to create a JavaScript application. Finally, I'm being asked if I want to use a custom Express server configuration. This would be very handy if you want to create some API endpoints endpoints that define your backend. But in my case, everything is going to be front-end. I'm going to retrieve the list of sessions for the conference from an existing API endpoint. So I'm going to say that I don't want a custom Express server configuration. So now this is downloading all the modules that are needed and creating all the files for my app. And meanwhile, I'm going to explain a bit the structure of a project created with this tool. So once we execute this command, a set of files are going to be created. You will see that we have the basic structure for an app with the index HTML file and so on, but you will see also some files that are there because we want you to follow all the high quality industry standards, and we want you to use a linter, we want you to use a code formatter, and we want you to write unit tests, because we aim for having high quality apps. Our package is going to depend on one module called LWC services. And this module is in charge of generating all the dependencies with the Lightning Web Components framework itself, but also with the other packages that we reference in our app, as for example, the linter, the code formatter, the jest framework, which is the unit test framework. And also we will have a dependency with a Webpack dev server, which is the server that we will use to develop locally. So hopefully this has finished. And now what we can do is to go into our conference app, and I can execute a command, which is npm run watch, that will start, we will bundle the resources of my application and will start serving that into my local host. Okay, so I already opened here my local host at port 3001, and this is the app that is created by default with the Create LWC app. You can see here that we have a greeting in several languages and a link to the documentation. So what we are going to do now is to modify this app to build our conference app, which is the purpose of this webinar. So let me close this app for a second, and what I'm going to do is to open the project in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is the IDE that we recommend because it plays very nicely with all the extensions that we provide and with the tooling that we have. And that's the reason we are going to use Visual Studio Code today. And here we can see the structure I was mentioning before and that we saw in the slides. So here, for example, we have all the configuration for the JavaScript linter that we are using. We are using the recommended Lightning Web Components configuration, which is the one that we use also on platform. And this one will help you find any issues with your JavaScript code and follow the best practices. Also, we have a basic configuration and another one which is stricter. We have also some files to configure the code formatter, and this will ensure that all the developers on the same team format the code in the same way. The configuration for the jest unit tests. Here is a file. We have a file that allows you to configure some parameters of this LWC services module. And finally, we have a package.json in which we can see that the tool has created this file taking into account everything that we specified in the wizard. We can see that there is a dependency with LWC services, And here it's interesting to take a look at the script section, because here is where we have all the scripts to be able to watch the project locally, which is what we just did, or for example to build it for production and to serve it from the folder that's created with all the bundled resources for production. So this is especially interesting because it contains the commands that you will be able to run with npm or yarn. And as you can see, this tool is very similar to the create app tool that we have in React or in Vue. So once said that, we are going to start our conference app. As I said, we're going to have a main component, which is the app component. In this app component, we are going to include another web component called session list. And this session list component is going to populate to show those sessions, making use of another component, which is going to be a service component. This means a component that doesn't have a UI. And that session service component is going to query an external endpoint, which is already there for us. We won't care about that endpoint in the presentation. When we click on a session, we want to show the details of a specific session, when does it take place, etc. And we will do that thanks to another component, which is called session details. And finally, we will want also to control the navigation in the app with the buttons that allow you to navigate in the browser window with the back button and forward button. So we will use the Windows history object to control the navigation. So the first thing that we're going to do is to simplify the app component, which is the first web component we are going to see in our project. So for that, let me go back to VS Code, and we're going to start exploring the files and folders that are created in the source folder. So here we can see that we have an index.html file. This is the entry point for our application. And here we can see our first web component. We see that this is a web component because it's not a standard HTML tag, but it looks like one, right? So in web components, we are going to have a namespace, which is basically the folder in which that component is stored. And then we will have the name of the component. So if here we are referencing my app component, that means that we are referencing this component here. And a component is built of several files. We have here an HTML file, JavaScript file, and CSS file. The only one that is compulsory is the JavaScript file, because we can have a component that just works with data and doesn't have any UI. And also, optionally, you can create your jest unit tests in the test folder. In this case, I'm going to remove the test folder because I don't want to take care of that. I'm also going to remove the greeting component because I'm not going to use it. And I'm going to simplify also a bit the index. I don't want these properties here. I will set a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 because I want to have a full screen app. And I'm going to simplify what we have in app HTML because we don't want to have that first component that we started with. So let me 1 second copy this code, and we're going to have something that is much simpler. So for now, what we're going to have is just a header, a header that says Lightning Conference, and we have a main attribute in which we will add all the components that we need for our conference app. So if I go back to the browser, well, oh, sorry, I forgot. Obviously, I stopped the server. So what I have to do is to start the server here again. What I'm going to do is to write npm run watch here, and this will start the server, and we will be able to see that in a moment. Okay. Okay, so this is happening because I forgot to include some CSS file in app.css. So let me do that for a second. I will stop this. And great. Okay, so here we have our first step done. We have our web component with our header. So the next step that we're going to do is to get the session list from the API endpoint that we have already up and running. So for that, we're going to create two components. The first component is going to be just a service component. We're going to call it session service, and that one is going to be in charge of retrieving, calling out to the endpoint. And second, we're going to create another component called session list. From this session list, we will import the functions that we define in the session service component, which is basically a JavaScript module, and we will execute that function to get the list of sessions. So what we are going to do now is first we are going to create a session service component, and as this is going to be just a data component, instead of storing that new component into the My folder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this folder data, and I'm going to create, sorry, not new file, but new folder, a new folder that will be the module that identifies my session service component. And this session service component is going to have a JavaScript file. In this JavaScript file, I'm going to copy some code that I had already created. And we can see here several things. So first of all, we are defining the URL, which is the API endpoint that we are going to hit. Then we can see that there are two functions defined that I'm exporting. I'm exporting them because I want to be able to use them in other web components. And the first one is using the fetch API. This is an API that belongs to ECMAScript 6 version. And this API allows you to fetch to hit an endpoint and fetch a result from that endpoint asynchronously using a promise. So basically, here we are going to hit that endpoint and return the sessions that will take place on the conference. And we have a second function that we are not going to use at the moment, but we will use it in a later step. This function allows you to filter these sessions by a session ID. We will use it when we create the session details component. So for now, remember that we have this get sessions function. So the second component that I want to create, I'm going to create it under my, because this is going to have a UI and it makes sense to have it here. And the second component is going to be called session list. In this case, for this component, I'm going to create a CSS file. I'm going to create an HTML file, and I'm going to create also a JavaScript file. So I will start copying the CSS because the CSS is straightforward. It's the same CSS that you write normally in any web application. And what is more interesting is taking a look at the HTML. So here we have the HTML for our session list component. We want to iterate over a list of sessions, and in Lightning Web Components we do that using a markup directive called for each. You can pass in an JavaScript object which is an array to this for each attribute, and then you can define a property that will identify every single session in the iteration, and also you can define another attribute that will identify the index of the item in the iteration. This is 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Then for each session you can do something, as for example here we are referencing the name, but we will improve this component later. But how do we get this sessions property? Well, for that we will need to write some JavaScript. So I'm going to paste here the JavaScript for our session list component. What are we doing here? Well, first, remember that function that we created in session service? We exported that function and we are importing that function here. And that way we are able to invoke this function in the connected callback. But what's the connected callback? Well, we said that Lightning Web Component Framework will take care of the life cycle of your components, when they are created, when they are inserted into the DOM, when they are disconnected from the DOM. Well, the framework then provides some hooks in which you can interfere to launch some logic. In this case, this is what we are doing. We want to execute this get sessions function once the component is connected to the DOM, because we want to get the sessions at that point. Then there is another interesting thing here that are properties. Properties are going to store the state of your components. You can reference properties from markup, and that's the reason we are using a property called sessions to store the result of our API call. This may feel weird to you, but it's not weird at all. This is just that we are assigning the result to both the all sessions properties and the sessions property, because in a later step we will implement filtering and we need to keep track of the sessions that are also filtered. And another thing that may attract your attention is this track decorator. This is something also that we have created in the Lightning Component Framework, and this marks a property as reactive. What does it mean that a property is reactive? Well, that the framework will re-render the component anytime that the value of this property changes. And that's that we want to do, because we will need that when we do filtering. So if I go to and I forgot, of course, because I created the session list component, but I do need to include that session list component into my app component. So I'm going to do that here. My session list and my session list. Okay, so now this should work and bring the sessions from the API endpoint. This is the API endpoint. I didn't show it to you, but it just returns some JSON. And we are processing the JSON through our session service component, and next through our session lists component. As you can see, I haven't had to refresh the page because thanks to the Webpack dev server that we are using here, we have the hot reloading features, and we can type meanwhile the local development server updates automatically. So the next thing that we are going to do is to improve our session list components. Instead of just having a name, we are going to add some, we are going to create some tiles for each session, and each tile will include a picture of the speaker. That's going to be very simple. What we are going to do is to just change our session list HTML. And what we are going to do is, instead of having this tag here that just shows the session name, I'm going to delete it and I'm going to paste something else. So what do we have now? Well, we have a link, because we want each tile to be clickable, and within that link we are showing the session details. We are showing the session name, the date, time, the room, etc. And the JSON structure that is returned by the JSON, but the API endpoint, it also returns the speakers. So what we're going to do here is to iterate over each session speakers, again using the template for each markup directive, and to show an image using the picture URL attribute of the speaker object, which is super simple, and as you can see, everything is standard HTML. So we are happy with the, I think I didn't show it to you. Here we have it, okay? This has a nice CSS effect. So what we are going to do now is to go with our fourth step, which is going to be add a search. We are going to add an input into the component that is going to allow us filtering those sessions client side. So what I'm going to do is, in my session list, just before the iteration over the sessions, I'm going to add an input tag. As you can see, this is HTML standard input. The only thing that we have here that is special is the way in which we are able to define a handler for the events that the HTML tag emits. In this case, we want to respond to the on input event. We could respond also to the change event, but we selected the input one. And what we are saying here is that we want the framework to execute this method code when that event occurs. But we need to define that method, right? Where should we do that? Well, in the JavaScript file. So that's what we are going to do now. I'm going to create a method which is an event handler. This is going to be a method of the session list class. Classes are also an ECMAScript 6 features. And in this way, I'm creating an event handler that receives the event as a parameter. And if you take a look at the documentation for this event, you will see that there is a value property that we can read to get whatever the user has written in the input. So what we're going to do is very simple. Now we are making use of all of these two properties that we created, the all sessions one and the sessions one. And what we will do is to filter the all sessions, use the filter function over the all sessions property to filter by the search key that the user has written on the input field that we have just created. And that way, this dot sessions property will have a new value, and as it is a track property, we will get that reflected into the UI, because there will be a re-rendering of the UI. So let's try that out. Here we have the sessions, and now I can filter by web components, feature, whatever, and this is filtering correctly. So great, we have done a lot. So the next thing that we're going to do is to create the session details component. For now, we are going to create the session details component just at the bottom of the page, because we don't want to take care of navigation yet. And what we are going to do is, once any of these rows of these tiles is clicked, we will show the session details component with the selected session details. So what we're going to do is to include the session list components and the session details components in the same page. We need to communicate these two components, right? Because we need to pass some information from the session list component to the details component. But sibling components cannot communicate directly in web components, right? So a typical pattern is that you have a wrapper component, a higher level component, and what you do is to pass the information from the one component to the wrapper component, and then you pass that information from the wrapper component to the child component. How we do that? Well, the way to pass information up to a parent component in web components is dispatching custom events. Same as the standard input tag was dispatching the input event, and we were able to define a handler for that event, we will do the same, but we will dispatch a custom event called navigate. When dispatching custom events, you can define what is carried into the payload of the event. And in this case, we want to carry the session ID, the selected session ID. Then in the app component, we will define a handler for the navigate event. And this handler will be in charge of getting the session ID from the event.detail property and pass that information down to the session details component. But how do we pass information down in web components? By using API properties. This is another decorator that we use to annotate properties. And if I define something as API, it could be a property but also a method, I'm saying that this is a public property of method, and that the purpose is that its value is set from outside. So you should never modify an API property from within the component in which it has been defined. So this is what we are going to do. So first thing that we are going to do is to define the session details component. We are going to create it because it doesn't exist yet. So here we are going to create the session details component. We are going to create the CSS file. We're going to create the HTML, and we will create the JavaScript file. I'm going to copy first the CSS because, again, this is straightforward. And then I'm going to copy the HTML. So here in the HTML, we can see that we are referencing a session property. This is the, the property that will hold information about the session and that we need to pass from the session list components somehow. Okay, we can see here that we are making use of another template directive, which is called template if true, that allows you to conditionally hide and show markup. And we are going ahead and we are going to create a session property, API property, so that the app component can pass the information down to this component. I've written this because this would be the normal way to create an API property. But this time we want to do something a bit different because we want to execute some logic when the value of this property is set. This is, we are going to receive the session ID, but we want to use that function that we created in our session service component to be able to retrieve the details of an individual sessions. So instead of creating the property this way, what we're going to do is to create a pair of getter and setter. When you create a getter and a setter, this is exactly the same of creating an API property called session ID, with the only difference that you can execute some logic when the property is set or when the property is get. In this case, we will execute the logic of calling that function from our session service data component. We will store that information in another property, which is a track property. Thanks to that, we will be able to render the details of our session. Okay, so we have our session details component ready. What we need to change is our session list component because we need to fire an event from it. So that's what we are going to do. I'm going to open here my session list component HTML. And here we can see that we have the link that we were clicking. And I'm going to add something else here. I'm going to add a reference to the index of the row because I will need that to know which session ID I'm referring to. And I'm going to add an event handler because I want to fire a custom event when the row is clicked, right? Handle session click. So what do we need to do next? Create the event handler in our session list JavaScript. We're going to do that here. And as you can see, what we are doing in this event handler is each time that a row is clicked, we are able to retrieve the index. This is the way that we have to access data attributes in HTML elements. And we will create a new custom event. The name of this new custom event is going to be navigate, and we will carry in the payload of the event the ID of the session that I have been able to retrieve from my sessions list thanks to the index, my filtered session list, right? This works also when we are using filtering. We have to create the event then, and then we will dispatch the event. So the only thing that is missing here is the glue that matches everything. That is the app component. So what we have to do is in the app component, we only have the session list components. Now that what we want to do is to create a handler for the event that we are firing in the session list component. We will do that by writing this code, okay? We will create the definition of the handler in the JavaScript file. So let's go to the JavaScript file and create the handler. We will do that in this way. And I'm missing here a track import. Yeah. And I'm missing here also brace. Great. So in this handler, what we are doing is to retrieve the session ID from the event detail property. Remember that one that is firing the session list component. And what else is missing? Well, we need to include the session details components in here. Great. So we have everything ready. We are firing the event. We are listening to the event here. We are executing this handler and passing the session ID. We're storing the session ID in a track property. And here you are seeing how we are binding the tracked property in the parent, in the app component, to the API property that we defined in the session detail. Again, this is a typical pattern that is very common to be used in UI development. So here we can see that now I'm able to click on the individual sessions and see the details there. We're going to do something else with the component, which is that we are going to implement navigation. So instead of when we click on a session showing the session details component on the bottom of the page, we are going to navigate to it. We are going to show it really and hide this component. And if the user presses the back button of the browser, we will be able to show the previous component because we will make use of the window history object. And for that, we need to modify just the app component. This is the only one that we have to modify. So the first thing that we are going to do is to store the state on the app constructor. Constructor is another lifecycle hook, and it allows me to override the default constructor and execute some logic when the component is constructed. In this case, we are going to define a state called list that is going to identify that I'm in the list page and I have to show that list component. We are going to store that state in the window history object. And we are going to define an event handler for the window pop state because we want to store always the state in a track property called state that we will use to take care of which component do we need to show at which time. If we are in the list state, we will show the list component. But if we are in the details state, we will show the details component. What else do I need to do here? Well, when I navigate to the session component, I need to store that I'm in a different state. I need to store that I'm in the details state. And I have all the state handling here already solved, but what I'm going to do is to hide or show a component in base to the value of this property. And a common way to do that is to define a pair of getter, well, two getters really in this case, okay? So what we are going to do is to define a getter that says to me if I am on the list state and another getter that says to me if I am on the details state, comparing the value of this dot state property with any of the states that we have defined. And how do we conditionally render markup in our HTML? Well, I'm going to exactly have the same as before, but I'm going to use a template if true markup directly. In this case, I will show the session list only if I'm in the state list, and I will show the session details if I am in the details state. Amazing. So if I go back to here, now this should work and show me the details or the list component depending on in which state I am. As you can see, the forward and back button from the browser works perfect. Okay, so let's do something else. This is great. We have build our conference app locally, but we want to give this a bit more of reality. So what I'm going to do is to follow the steps to upload the app to a Heroku instance and run it. So for that, I'm going to open here the command line. I'm going to start my local development server because I don't want that anymore. And the first thing that I'm going to do is is to run the npm run build script. This is going to bundle of the conference app resources, and it's going to create a dist file with all the resources bundled and minified. So the next thing that we are going to do is to create a proc file. If you are familiar with Heroku, that's the way that we have to define which processes will run into Heroku. And we are going to define a web process, which is going to be executing the npm run serve command. The next thing that I need to do is to log in into Heroku. This is going to open a browser. Okay, it opened it in a different window, but we have it here. I can now log into the Heroku CLI because I was already logged with my Heroku credentials. This has worked. And now what we can do is to create an app in Heroku. So I'm going to create an app in Heroku called Conference App Alba. We do that with the Heroku apps create command. And we're going to add a remote to that app. Great. So now that we have everything set up for the app, what we need to do is to commit and push our code to that app in Heroku, which is basically a Git remote, right? So what I would do is to do a Git add. I will do a Git commit minus m initial commit, and we will do a Git push Heroku master. Great. So this is uploading all my code to Heroku and running it. And in some seconds, we will be able to see the app up and running in Heroku. Should be just some seconds. Sometimes it takes some more seconds, but it should work in a second, and we will see our app running nicely in Heroku. Well, meanwhile, as it is taking some time, meanwhile, I'm going to continue with the next slide. So this project, what I have done today, it's something that you can do by yourself because this is a Trailhead project. Here you have the link to the Trailhead project. It has one more step, which is create some speaker cards. I didn't include that step into the webinar because of the time, but basically is exactly the same that I have done today. So if you have questions, if you have doubts, or if you simply want to start your journey towards Lightning Web Components development, go to Trailhead because this is the best way to learn. And we're going, still not ready. We have also a couple of modules in Trailhead, which are Lightning Web Components, OSS, we call OSS to the open source part. Which help you, show you how to build these web components, which are the continuation of this project. So in this project, we built the app of a platform, but there is another project that allows you to retrieve data from Salesforce, and there is another project that shows you how to move these web components into Salesforce. So I strongly recommend you to do that. And well, here we have our app. Fantastic. We are going to open that app. And again, this has opened in a different browser, but here we have the app. This is the app up and running in a Heroku instance, and this is exactly what we code during the webinar. Okay, so we have arrived to the end of the webinar. We're going to have some minutes for Q&A. I know that Peter, who is another developer evangelist, has been answering some questions online, but there may be some questions that are of interest of the audience. I don't know, Peter, if you want to talk and maybe ask some of the questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alba.
I can't hear you really, Peter. I don't know if the rest of people can hear you, but I hear you like very far away.
Okay, hang on 1 second. Okay, how's that?
And much better.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Alba. So the first question that I'll share was a question, can I host these custom apps in my private hosting, such as wrapping with PHP? So I think the first answer to that question is, can I host that in my custom apps? So can I build a custom app with this? And I think what you just showed was yes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you saw how we were able to run it in Heroku, but you could run it, for example, in AWS or landing pages or somewhere else. So that's something that you can definitely do. That's the purpose of the framework, really.
Now the next one I thought was kind of interesting, which is, could I wrap it with PHP? Are you familiar with PHP, Alba? Because I've only done just the barest minimum of PHP in the past.
Yeah, so I've done a minimal of PHP in the past, and I guess that you could do it.
Yeah, I'm not sure why.
So,
It's the only thing.
yeah, that's the thing. I'm not sure either. Why would you do? Would you want to do that? Because, well, what modern web development is expected to do is a separation between like all the front end part and the backend part. So a better design for your application would be to create your backend accessible through a series of API endpoints, and then be able to query that from your front-end part, and from that you wouldn't need necessarily to use PHP, right?
Yeah, and again, this is just me. This is secondhand knowledge of hearing friends talk about what they're doing with PHP. But my understanding is sort of modern versions of PHP, like one of the more common architectures with that is a more sort of build your API backend in PHP and then have a front-end framework that references that. And of course, in that architecture, the Lightning Web Components open source option would work perfectly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then the next one was also sort of a follow-on, and then it said, and any other server-side language like JSP. And to me, that brought up the interesting question of, server-side versus client-side compiling. And we've kind of gone full circle on that now, where 15 years ago, the state of the art was, of course, server-side rendered. And I'm sure you worked with JSP pages as well, Alba.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure about that, Peter.
Okay, so so with JSP, you'd have sort of a server-side compiled page, and that was always a really straightforward. The reason for that is because the browser couldn't do the work of rendering HTML. Then we went to sort of client-side frameworks. The whole point of LWC is really to have a to use the standard web APIs that support custom components in the first place. So there's like less of that custom HTML rendering that modern frameworks are doing.
Oh, yes. So DSP is kind of visual force, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So the last question, because we're running up on time, was a question that I thought I'd put out there, which question of can I implement custom decorators in an LWC application? And just doing some checking on that, the custom decorator specification is not in final stage support or finished proposal stage 4 for the spec. So as of today, because it's still in stage 2, we don't support custom decorators in LWC. So, it looks like, once the browser vendors bring that spec into, or once it comes into final stage or final finished proposal and browser vendors implement that, there may be an opportunity for custom decorators. And that's it.
Great. So thank you so much, Peter. We are running out of time. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are other channels in which you can ask your question, and we will be very happy to answer that. And also, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be published on the CodeMotion site. Thank you so much for attending today, and I hope that you enjoyed the webinar.